The envelope was ivory, with gold trim thick enough to feel expensive between my fingers. My name, Isabel Monroe, was written in my mother's unmistakable cursive, sharp, elegant, and cold. I set it down beside my mug of coffee, staring at it for a moment like it might detonate. The return address was from Santa Barbara, a beachfront villa I'd seen once, on a glossy brochure. I told myself it was just another social announcement, maybe a belated holiday card. But when I slid my thumb under the seal, I caught a faint whiff of her perfume, that powdery rose scent that had always made me feel small. Inside was a wedding invitation printed on shimmering paper gold, lettering so bright it almost hurt to look at. It said what I never imagined I'd read in my lifetime. Mr. and Mrs. Monroe joyfully invite you to celebrate the renewal of their vows. My parents, divorced for 10 years, reuniting in a ceremony I hadn't even heard about until now, and below the flourish of calligraphy, a smaller note pressed into the paper, as if someone wanted to carve it into my skin. You may attend only if you apologize publicly for the past. I read it once, then twice. The words blurred on the third pass as something inside me broke loose. 10 years of being called a disappointment, a failure, the reason they fell apart now, repackaged into a single condition that turned an invitation into humiliation. My pulse thudded in my ears. I took a sip of coffee, but it had gone cold bitter on my tongue. At that exact moment, my phone buzzed. A new email subject line: guest list confirmation, Monroe wedding. It was from a planner named Claire. The message was brief, almost polite. Per Mrs. Monroe's instruction, Miss Isabel Monroe is not to be admitted to the ceremony unless a formal apology is delivered prior to entry. My stomach twisted. They had turned my name into a security threat. That was the moment something inside me snapped. The words formed in my head before I even realized I'd spoken them out loud. Ethan looked up from the stove, a spatula in one hand, still wearing his half-loosened tie from his morning meeting. "What's wrong?" he asked, his brow furrowing. I didn't answer at first. I just handed him the card and my phone, my fingers trembling despite the anger beginning to burn through the shock. He read in silence, his expression tightening, as his eyes moved down the page. When he looked back at me, there was disbelief mixed with fury. "They really wrote this," he said quietly. "They actually told people to stop you at the door." I nodded, my throat dry. "They want me to beg," I whispered, in front of everyone. He set the papers down gently like they were something toxic. "You don't owe them that, Izzy." His voice was calm but firm. "You've spent your whole life trying to make them proud. When does it stop?" I wanted to answer, but my voice wouldn't come. The words from the invitation echoed in my mind like a verdict: apologize publicly for the past. The past. That endless graveyard of accusations they'd buried me in since childhood. I could still hear my mother's voice from years ago, crisp as glass. "If you'd tried harder, maybe your father wouldn't have left." I'd been 10 years old, holding my backpack by the strap as she said it. Now, decades later, she was rewriting the same story on gold-trimmed paper. I sank into the chair by the window, Portland's gray light washing through the glass. Outside, the rain hadn't stopped for days. It fell steady and unfeeling, like the city itself knew how to match my mood. Ethan sat across from me, elbows on the table, eyes soft but steady. "You can't keep doing this," he said. "They keep moving the goalpost. First it was money, then it was your time, now it's your dignity." A humorless laugh escaped me. "My mother doesn't care about dignity. She cares about control." He reached for my hand, his palm warm against my cold fingers, then stopped, giving it to her. His words lingered in the air, simple but impossible. Because even after everything, part of me still craved what she'd never given: approval, a glimpse of being enough. I stared at the invitation again. The shimmer of the gold foil reflected in my coffee like liquid sunlight, mocking me. "They're remarrying," I said softly. "After everything they did to each other. And somehow I'm the one who still has to say sorry." Ethan exhaled, shaking his head. "It's a performance, Izzy. The whole thing. They just want the world to see a perfect family again. Even if it means erasing you to get it, erase me. The words settled deep, heavy, true. I could see it now, my parents smiling in front of photographers, pretending the last decade hadn't happened. My absence wouldn't just be accepted. It would be proof of their story that I was the problem child who didn't deserve a seat at the table. I closed my eyes and saw flashes of the years I'd spent trying to prove them wrong. Late nights at the drafting desk working on architecture projects I hoped they'd notice. Phone calls with my mother that always ended in sighs. "You're still doing that job?" she'd ask. "I thought you'd have something to show by now." No matter how many designs I completed, how many clients praised my work, she only saw the daughter who'd cost them everything. The rain outside turned harder, streaking the glass in silver lines. I traced one with my finger, trying to anchor myself. I remembered the last time I saw them together at my brother Brandon's wedding 3 years ago. My mother had worn pearls, my father a smile too wide to be sincere. They'd posed for pictures like the divorce had never happened. And me, I stood at the edge of the dance floor, pretending the ache in my chest was just exhaustion. After that night, I promised myself I was done chasing their approval. But promises are fragile when it comes to family. Now, sitting here with this invitation in front of me, I realized I was back where I started. 10 years old, holding something I didn't ask for, being told to apologize for existing. Ethan stood and came around the table, crouching beside me. "Listen," he said, his voice low. "You don't have to go. You don't have to play their game." "I paid for part of it," I said without thinking. "The catering deposit. My father said it was a temporary loan until he could reimburse me." Ethan looked at me sharply. "How much?" "$8,000. He blinked. "You already gave them $8,000 and they still did this." I nodded, shame heating my face. "I thought if I helped, maybe they'd—" He interrupted gently. "Izzy, they're not going to change. You can't buy what they don't have to give." The truth of it burned, but it also cleared something in me. The fog that had hung between guilt and hope began to thin. I stood pacing toward the counter, the invitation still clutched in my hand. My reflection in the kitchen window looked strange, older, harder. "You know what's funny?" I said quietly. "They told everyone I was ungrateful. That I never gave back. But I've been paying their bills for years." Ethan watched me carefully. "Then maybe it's time they pay." I turned toward him, the corner of my mouth lifting just slightly. It wasn't a smile, not yet. But it was the start of something close. "They wanted an apology," I said. "Instead, they just woke up the woman they tried to silence." The rain outside eased into a drizzle, soft but steady. I folded the invitation back into its envelope, pressing the seal shut like closing a wound. The gold lettering caught the dim light as I set it aside. In the reflection of the window, I saw my own eyes, tired but unbroken. Somewhere deep in my chest, beneath the layers of anger and sorrow, a thought began to form. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet. It was something colder, cleaner. A promise that this time, when they drew their lines, I would draw mine deeper. Ethan poured another cup of coffee, setting it in front of me. "What are you thinking?" he asked. I looked at the envelope once more. "I'm thinking they just handed me a reason to finally stop apologizing." Outside, the clouds began to break, a sliver of pale sunlight sliding across the wet pavement. I didn't know yet what I would do, but for the first time in years I felt the edges of my own power. The invitation lay between us like a challenge. I took a slow breath, feeling it steady me. "They wanted a show," I said quietly. "Maybe I'll give them one. The memory always starts the same way." The sound of shouting, the crash of glass, the weight of the night pressing down on my 10-year-old chest as I stood frozen in the hallway. My father's suitcase lay open by the door, half-packed, his shirts spilling over the edges like a flood he couldn't contain. My mother's voice sliced through the house, sharp, relentless, the kind of anger that leaves no room for air. I remember clinging to the wall, my bare feet cold on the hardwood. My father looked at me once, just once, before he turned toward the door. "If you'd kept quiet about the job, he wouldn't have left," my mother said. The words hit harder than the sound of the door slamming. That was the night I stopped being a child and started being their scapegoat. The house looked perfect from the outside. A neat lawn trimmed every Saturday, blue shutters that matched my mother's dresses, the faint smell of gardenias drifting from the porch. But inside, everything was measured in tension. My mother Lydia moved through rooms, like a queen surveying her territory, her heels clicking on the tile. My father Richard kept to his study, the smell of whiskey and paper mixing in the air. And then there was my brother Brandon, the golden child. Blonde, charming with a smile that made adults coo, and teachers forgive his every mistake. He could do no wrong. If he broke a vase, I must have distracted him. If he lied, I must have influenced him. My mother said it often enough that it became a rule of nature. "Brandon's our pride," she'd say, placing a hand on his shoulder. Then, with the same breath, she'd look at me. "And you, Isabel, are our problem. There's one memory that never fades." It was Brandon's 8th birthday, a backyard party with balloons, a rented clown, a cake taller than my forearm. I helped set the table, tied ribbons on chairs, and smiled until my cheeks hurt. A month later, when my own birthday came, I woke up to a grocery store cupcake with a candle already half melted. My mother was on the phone planning something else, waving me away. "You'll have a big celebration when you learn to behave," she said, without looking up. That day, I stopped asking for parties. I stopped asking for much of anything. School wasn't a refuge either. When a classmate's wallet went missing, the teacher asked if anyone had seen it. No one spoke. I felt the air shift, eyes turning toward me. The next thing I knew, I was sitting in the principal's office, hands twisting in my lap. They called my mother. She arrived in a swirl of perfume and disapproval. "She's always been difficult," she said to the principal before I could open my mouth. I'm not surprised. I wanted to scream that I hadn't taken anything, but the words lodged somewhere behind my teeth. When we got home, she didn't speak to me at all. That silence burned worse than any scolding. There was a summer when I thought maybe things would change. My mother promised we'd all go to Hawaii, a family trip to start fresh, she said. I spent weeks saving my allowance, even packed my swimsuit in a small red bag. The morning of the trip, I waited by the front door, shoes on, ready. The car pulled out of the driveway without me. Brandon waved from the back seat, his hand small against the glass. On the fridge, a note in my mother's handwriting waited. House chores must be done first. I cleaned every dish until my knees ached, though I knew she never meant for me to go. That night, I ate leftovers alone, the sound of the clock ticking like it was keeping score. I tried so hard to be good after that, to earn her smile, her touch, anything. I stopped talking back, stopped asking questions. I did the dishes before being told, brought home straight A's, stayed after school to help teachers. Once, when I received a certificate for academic excellence, I left it on the kitchen counter beside her morning coffee. She glanced at it and said, "Brandon would have done that sooner." I stood there waiting for something else, maybe a hint of pride, but her phone rang, and the moment vanished. That was the first time I realized achievement couldn't buy affection. Silence became my survival. My mother said once, "Good girls don't talk back," and I took it as gospel. I learned to measure my breath, to read her moods by the tilt of her chin, the rhythm of her sighs. Brandon filled the house with laughter. I filled it with quiet. The less I said, the less she could twist my words into weapons. I thought invisibility might make me safe. Instead, it made me disappear. I remember the last night my father was home. I was 16 by then, old enough to know the patterns of their fights, the way her voice would rise, the way his hands would tighten at his sides. That night, his suitcase was packed again. I heard them arguing through the wall. "She's not the reason you're unhappy," he shouted. My mother's reply was low but venomous. "She's the reason you stayed." I crept down the hall, heart pounding, and saw him standing by the door, exhausted. He looked at me for a long moment, then said, "Take care of yourself, Izzy." And just like that, he was gone. My mother turned her face, pale but composed. "He left because you can't keep your mouth shut." She poured herself a drink and turned on the television. I stood there, numb, the blue light flickering over both of us. After that, our house became a place of ghosts. My father's study stayed locked, his books gathering dust. My mother spoke less and drank more. Brandon went off to college and became the Monroe success story, the proof that the family name still meant something. I was left behind with the echo of my mother's favorite sentence, "You ruined this family." She said it once while I was washing dishes once, while folding laundry once when I laughed too loud. The words settled into me until I believed them. Every wrong thing that happened, an unpaid bill, a broken appliance, a bad mood, became my fault. I carried that blame like a second skin. But children grow up, even the broken ones. By the time I turned 18, I had learned how to smile in photos, how to nod when people said, "You have your mother's eyes." I learned to hide the tremor in my hands when she called me selfish, to make my face blank when she said I'd never be enough. The night before I left for college, she stood in my doorway, arms crossed. "Don't embarrass us," she said. I wanted to tell her I wasn't leaving to shame her, I was leaving to survive her. Instead, I just said, "I'll try." She didn't answer. She just turned off the light and closed the door. Years later, when people asked why I seemed so calm under pressure, I never told them the truth. That I'd spent my childhood learning to read danger in the smallest sigh, the slightest glance. That every decision I made came from the same instinct to avoid setting her off. To this day, I still flinch when someone raises their voice. Sometimes I wonder if she ever realized what she created. If she knew that every "you're too much" turned into silence, every "you'll never make it" became the engine of my ambition. I doubt it. Control doesn't recognize its victims. It only recognizes obedience. I carried those lessons into adulthood without knowing it. The guilt, the need to fix things to please people who had already decided I wasn't enough. Even as I built my own life, her voice followed me, whispering through every choice. "You owe me. You'll always owe me." Sitting at my kitchen table now, years later, staring at that wedding invitation, I realized something. My mother's words that night when I was 10. "If you hadn't told him about the job, he wouldn't have left," never really stopped echoing. She'd been rewriting that moment my entire life, turning it into a story where I was the villain and she the martyr. And I had believed her, but that belief was cracking. The older I got, the clearer it became. I hadn't broken that family. They had. I was just the easiest one to blame. Rain started tapping against the windows, steady and soft. I thought about the little girl scrubbing floors while her family flew to Hawaii, about the teenager standing in the hallway watching her father leave, about every time I tried to earn love that was never coming. Maybe that's why the invitation hurt so much. It wasn't new, it was the same wound reopening. Ethan came into the kitchen, warm light spilling from behind him. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there watching me trace the rim of my coffee cup. "You're somewhere else again," he said gently. I nodded. "Just remembering. My mother's been blaming me since I was a kid." He pulled out the chair beside me and sat down. "You don't have to let her anymore." "I know," I whispered. "But knowing and believing are two different things." He reached across the table, his hand warm over mine. "Then, start believing." Outside, the rain grew heavier, drumming softly against the glass. I looked down at our hands, his steady mind trembling, and took a breath that didn't taste like fear. "If they still think I owe them," I said quietly, "maybe it's time to settle the debt. On my terms." The bus station smelled like diesel and rain. I remember gripping the handle of my suitcase, staring at the gray sky as the driver loaded luggage into the compartment below. I was 18, fresh out of high school, holding a one-way ticket from San Diego to Portland. My mother had barely looked up when I told her I was leaving for college. She said, "Don't forget your student loans are under my name," as if that were her version of goodbye. My father didn't call at all. Brandon, home from college for the summer, just shrugged and said, "Good luck being the family disappointment in another state." The bus door hissed open. When I stepped on it, felt like walking off a cliff. I didn't know where the road would take me, only that it had to be away from them. Portland greeted me with cold air and the smell of wet pine. The city wasn't beautiful in the usual sense. It was quiet, gray, a little lonely. But that loneliness was mine. I moved into a small studio apartment near the university, a place with peeling wallpaper and a faucet that dripped every night. I could hear my neighbor's TV through the wall and the distant hum of traffic below. For the first time in my life, no one told me what to say, how to dress, when to come home. Freedom was terrifying and wonderful all at once. I threw myself into my architecture classes. The sound of pencils scratching over blueprints, the smell of ink, the feeling of creating something from nothing, it all made sense in a way my family never had. My professors said I had an eye for detail, that I designed buildings that felt like they wanted to protect people. I smiled when they said that because they didn't know how much I needed to feel safe myself. I worked part-time at a coffee shop near campus, saving every dollar I could. Each paycheck felt like proof that I was surviving without them. But my mother found ways to pull me back in. The first time she called, it was about money. "Your father stopped sending support," she said. "I'm drowning in bills." I still remember the guilt that crawled up my throat. I transferred $300 from my savings that same night. She didn't say thank you, just, "You should be grateful you can help." It became a pattern. Every few months, a new crisis. A car payment, a medical bill, a credit card maxed out. Each time I helped, hoping it might earn some softness, some affection. It never did. Instead, it became expected. "Family takes care of family," she'd remind me, her voice honeyed but sharp. By the time I graduated, I was exhausted but proud. I had a degree, a job offer from a small architecture firm downtown, and a chance to start over completely. I sent my mother a photo of me in my cap and gown. She replied, "So, what now? You think you've made it?" My father sent a short email later that night. "Architecture's not a stable field. You should have joined the family business." I didn't reply to either of them. Still, when my first paycheck came, I wired my mother another $500. Old habits die hard. The firm where I worked was small but ambitious. My boss, a woman named Diane, believed in clean lines and open spaces. "Architecture should breathe," she used to say. I stayed late most nights, tracing plans under a desk lamp, surrounded by the hum of computers and the faint scent of coffee. I thought if I built enough, worked hard enough, maybe I could construct a version of myself untouched by their words. For a while I did. Until the day my father called. It was a Sunday morning, the sky outside streaked with soft light. He started with small talk, which was unusual enough to make my stomach twist. Then he said, "Your mother and I are thinking of expanding Monroe Holdings. We want to make it a family legacy. You'd be part of it." I hesitated. Monroe Holdings was their investment venture, something I barely understood except that they used it to manage real estate and small business funds. "It'll secure our future," he said. "You can contribute your savings. We'll make sure your name's on everything." I wanted to believe him. Maybe this was his way of including me, of finally seeing me as more than the mistake who left. I transferred the money 2 days later. When the paperwork arrived, it looked official: bank seals, signatures, columns of numbers. My name appeared on the documents beside theirs. For the first time, it felt like I belonged to something. My mother even called, her voice soft. "You did the right thing," she said. "Now we're really a family again." I hung up with tears in my eyes. I didn't realize then that I'd just handed them the keys to my financial cage. Over the next 2 years, I built my life piece by piece. My apartment grew nicer, my projects larger, my confidence steadier. Yet my mother's calls never stopped. "Your brother just bought a new car," she'd say, "and I can barely pay the water bill." I'd hear her sniffle through the phone and my heart would twist. I told myself I was doing my duty, that helping her was a small price for peace. What I didn't see was how much of myself I was losing in the process. There was one night I'll never forget. I'd just finished a project presentation that got rave reviews from a client. I felt proud, so proud, that I called my mother to share the news. "That's nice," she said. "Now about my rent." The pride vanished as quickly as it came. She listed amounts, dates, deadlines. I stared at the wall, the laughter of my colleagues still echoing in the background. When she hung up, I realized she hadn't even asked what the project was. By 27, I'd been promoted twice and had enough savings to replace my old Honda with a newer model. The same week, my father emailed about expanding the family venture. He wanted me to sign another set of papers, just a temporary authorization, he said. He promised it was harmless, a way to streamline their business accounts. I skimmed the document, saw my name, and signed. It was easier than asking questions. That signature would come back years later like a ghost with my handwriting. The months blurred together, work bills, family calls. Every time my phone lit up with Mom, my chest tightened. It didn't matter how far I moved, she was always just a ringtone away. There were nights I'd sit on my balcony watching the rain soak the city and wonder why freedom still felt like guilt. I'd tell myself I was helping because I loved her. But deep down, I knew love shouldn't feel like a debt. Once, after a long week, I called her just to talk, not about money, not about obligations. I asked how she was. She sighed, tired. Brandon hasn't called. Your father's useless. At least you try to make yourself useful. I swallowed the hurt, told her I loved her, and hung up. Ethan, who I'd been dating for a year by then, found me sitting on the couch staring into space. She asked for money again, he said. I shook my head. Worse. She didn't have to. 3 years after that call, my father convinced me to sign one more document. This time it was a rental guarantee for Monroe Holdings, something about a new office space. You're just a backup signature, he promised. Purely procedural. I believed him. I always did. The papers arrived by email, full of legal language I didn't understand. I signed them between client meetings and never thought about them again. I didn't know that every one of those signatures gave me control, not them. Not yet. By my early 30s, I had what looked like a good life. A job I loved, a partner who understood me, and enough distance from my family to breathe. Still, their voices haunted the quiet. Whenever I designed something beautiful, a house with sunlight streaming through open windows, I'd think, would they finally be proud of me? The answer was always the same. One rainy Friday evening, I came home late to find a voicemail from my mother. Her tone was sharp, impatient. Your father says you missed the dividend transfer. The business needs your attention. Don't make us regret trusting you. I stared at the message, anger prickling under my skin. I'd spent years giving, signing, fixing, and somehow I was still the one being blamed. I deleted the message, but her voice stayed. It always did. That night, I stood by the window, the city lights reflecting in the glass. My reflection looked older, steadier, but still shadowed by her. No matter how far I moved, I whispered to myself, I'm still orbiting them. Ethan came up behind me, wrapping his arms around my shoulders. You don't have to anymore, he said softly. I wanted to believe him. A week later, my mother sent a text that would change everything. We have big plans coming soon. You'll finally make us proud. I didn't know what she meant. I smiled bitterly, thinking it was another investment scheme. I didn't realize those big plans were her wedding. The one I would unknowingly fund. The one that would make the rest of my life unravel. If I had known then what I know now, that my hard work, my savings, every silent act of obedience would become the stage for their final act of cruelty, I might have signed my name differently. But I didn't. I kept believing that if I gave enough, they'd stop taking. I thought silence would buy peace. It never did. It only bought time for the storm that was already coming. The call came on a Tuesday morning. I was at my desk halfway through sketching a residential project when my phone buzzed with a number I didn't recognize. This is Claire, the wedding planner for the Monroe event, the voice said cheerfully. I almost corrected her, ready to explain she had the wrong Isabel, but then she added, Your mother asked me to confirm some details with you. My pencil froze mid-line. She continued, her tone clipped and professional. Per Mrs. Monroe's instruction, if you arrive at the venue without a public apology, security will not allow you inside. The words hung there, clean and cold, slicing through the hum of office chatter. I swallowed hard, trying to find my voice. "Excuse me, yes, ma'am," she said. "Your parents want to avoid any disruptions. They said it's best for everyone if things remain peaceful, peaceful." The same word my mother had used all my life to mean silent. I forced a laugh that didn't sound like me. "That's fine," I said. "I'll make sure there's no disruption." "Thank you," Claire replied brightly. "Your mother will be relieved." When the call ended, I sat there staring at the unfinished blueprint in front of me. My hands trembled not from sadness this time, but from disbelief. Even after everything, after funding their new perfect union, they still needed to humiliate me one last time. A security ban. My own parents had put me on a list like I was a trespasser in a life I'd already paid for. I walked out of the office, ignoring the curious glances of coworkers, and stepped into the Portland drizzle. The rain fell light but relentless, the kind that soaked through your sleeves before you noticed. Cars hissed past on the wet pavement. I stood there feeling like the whole world was in motion while I was stuck in place. My mother's voice played in my head. "We just want peace." I could almost see her smile as she said it, smooth and smug, her favorite performance. By the time I got home, my phone was vibrating again. I didn't have to look to know it was her. I let it ring out. Then another message popped up. "Hope you're behaving yourself. Don't make this difficult for us." I threw the phone on the counter. That night, Ethan made pasta. He noticed my silence long before I said a word. "What happened?" he asked, twirling spaghetti onto a plate. I told him about the call, about the security, about the word peaceful. He stared at me for a long moment, his jaw tightening. They hired security for their own daughter. "Apparently, I'm a threat to their happiness," I said bitterly. He set the plate down, his eyes burning with quiet anger. "Izzy, you paid for that happiness. You're the reason that wedding's even possible." I gave a small, humorless laugh. "And yet I'm still the stain they can't scrub out." He came around the table, crouching beside me. "Then stop letting them use you. Close the accounts. Don't fund a single flower." "I can't," I whispered. "That would make me like them." Ethan shook his head. "No, that would make you free." But freedom sounded too much like abandonment, and I wasn't ready to abandon the last thread of hope that maybe, just maybe, they'd realize what they were doing. So I said nothing. I just sat there staring at the flickering candle on the table, watching it burn down to nothing. When he went to bed, I stayed up opening my laptop. I started pulling up my bank records, invoices, and every email related to the wedding. I wanted to see for once where I stood in all this. What I found made my stomach twist. Every contract, venue, catering, florist, music, photography was signed under my name. My mother's name didn't appear on a single one. The invoices, all the payments, all of it tied to my account. I scrolled through the PDFs, reading each header like it was a revelation. Authorized by Isabel Monroe, again and again. I'd signed them myself, blind, with a sense of duty, wanting to keep the peace. My peace had built their empire. My inbox pinged with a new message. From the planner again. "Thank you, Miss Monroe, for your quick payment of the final deposit. Your family's event is now fully confirmed." My family's event. The phrase made my skin crawl. I leaned back in my chair, heart pounding. I wasn't just the financier, I was the legal client. Everything they'd built stood on my approval, and if I withdrew that approval, it would all collapse. The thought was intoxicating, terrifying, electric. I imagined my mother's face, her lips parting in disbelief, her carefully controlled world falling apart because the daughter she erased had finally decided to stop playing along. Then guilt flooded in, washing away the fantasy. Was that really me? Would I really do something like that? I didn't sleep that night. I just sat there, surrounded by documents and memories that suddenly felt connected in a way they never had before. The next morning, I called someone I hadn't spoken to in years, Ava Reynolds. We'd been close in college before she went to law school. She'd become a property lawyer in Portland, someone who understood contracts better than anyone I knew. When she picked up, her voice was warm but wary. "Izzy, wow, it's been ages. I need to ask you something," I said, my voice shaking. "If someone signs contracts for an event, venues, vendors, catering, and every agreement is under their name, who owns the rights to cancel them?" She was silent for a beat. "The person who signed, obviously." "Why?" I hesitated, then said, "Because I think I just discovered that every single thing for my parents' wedding is under my name." I heard her inhale sharply. "You're kidding. I wish I were." "Well," she said slowly, "if that's true, then they've got a big problem. You're the client of record. Without your authorization, none of those services can legally proceed." The world seemed to tilt for a second. Meaning, Ava said, her tone careful. "If you wanted to, you could cancel everything. Right now. The venue, the flowers, the music, all of it." I laughed, but it came out hollow. "That would be nuclear." She didn't laugh with me. "Izzy, after everything you've told me over the years about them, maybe it's time they learned what nuclear feels like." When I hung up, my hands were cold, but my mind was burning. I walked to the window, watching the morning light creep across the rain-slicked street. The city was waking up, people heading to jobs, buses groaning, coffee steam rising from carts on the corner. Life kept moving. Mine had been paused for so long, waiting for permission to matter. Ethan called from the bedroom. "You coming in today?" "In a bit," I said, still staring out the window. "Everything okay?" "I don't know," I answered honestly, "but I think it's about to be." That evening, Ava sent me an email titled "Ownership Confirmation." It outlined every contract, every clause, every line that tied the event to me. Her note was short but pointed. "If you want to take action, you're legally covered. Just say the word." I reread it twice before closing my laptop. My reflection in the screen looked unfamiliar, calm, focused, unflinching. When Ethan came home, I told him everything. He listened without interrupting, just tracing circles with his thumb on my hand. When I finished, he said, "So you hold all the power?" I exhaled. "I guess I do." He leaned forward. "Then use it." I shook my head slowly. "If I do, they'll call me cruel." Ethan's voice was steady. "They already call you everything except what you are. You don't owe them kindness for what they never gave you." I wanted to argue, but the truth was sitting there between us like a third presence, solid, undeniable. I wasn't angry anymore, just tired of being the one who paid for everyone else's comfort. Later that night, while Ethan slept, I sat at the dining table, laptop open again. Ava had attached another document, an optional freeze request for joint accounts tied to Monroe Holdings. It required one signature, mine. I stared at it for a long time, tracing the outline of my name at the bottom. Somewhere in another state, my mother was probably arranging seating charts, picking out champagne, talking about perfection. I clicked the pen on the table, a tiny rhythmic sound breaking the silence. Then I reached for the mouse. When the digital signature glowed blue on the screen, I felt something inside me shift. It wasn't guilt. It wasn't triumph. It was quiet, clean, and final, like a door closing softly after years of being left open. They had spent a lifetime teaching me that silence meant surrender. But now, sitting there under the dim kitchen light, I realized silence could mean something else entirely. Strategy. Control. Power. For the first time, my name didn't feel like a chain. It felt like a weapon, and I had just learned how to use it. The ocean glittered like glass, that afternoon sunlight rippling over the waves outside the restaurant windows. La Mer Azul was one of those places that smelled faintly of salt and citrus, the kind of venue my mother loved to use as a stage. I arrived 5 minutes early, still unsure why I'd agreed to come. Her message had been short: lunch with the family. Time to start fresh before the wedding. It sounded innocent, but nothing involving Lydia Monroe ever was. Inside, the hostess led me to a long table near the windows. My parents were already seated, faces glowing in the golden light, like actors waiting for their cue. My mother's dress was a shade of icy blue that matched the sea behind her, pearls at her throat, smile sharp as glass. My father wore his usual uniform, crisp white shirt, expensive watch. The air of a man who still thought control looked like kindness. Brandon sat beside them, his wife Emily scrolling through her phone. When my mother looked up, her lips curled into that familiar, polished smirk. "We didn't think you'd actually come," she said. "If you invite me, I come," I said quietly, taking the chair at the end of the table. The view of the ocean was breathtaking. Too bad the company spoiled it. Brandon leaned back, his grin lazy. "Look who decided to show up without an apology banner." Brandon, my father, warned mildly, but his eyes gleamed with amusement. My mother only smiled wider. "Don't tease your sister. It's unbecoming." They ordered wine, laughter bubbling among them like champagne. When the waiter turned to me, my mother interjected smoothly, "She'll have water. No wine for her." I froze. It was such a small command, so practiced, that the air itself seemed to bend around it. I could feel my cheeks flush, the same familiar heat I'd known since childhood. Control disguised as care. "Water's fine," I murmured, my voice barely above the sound of the ocean outside. The conversation rolled on without me. My mother told stories about the upcoming wedding, about the guest list, filled with executives and socialites, about how we want everything to be perfect this time. Every word dripped with performance, as if she were being filmed. When the food arrived, I barely tasted it. The clink of silverware felt like punctuation to her monologue. She spoke of perfection, of rebirth, of love, never once acknowledging the person who had funded all of it. Then a woman across the table, one of my mother's friends from her charity circle, asked Lydia, "This must be costing a fortune. How are you managing such a lavish event?" My mother laughed, tossing her hair back. "Let's just say my daughter owed me, and now she's finally paying it back." The laughter that followed was polite, thin, the kind of sound people make when they don't know where to look. I felt my stomach twist. Brandon smirked, stabbing his fork into a piece of salmon. "About time she contributed to the family name," he said. Something inside me cracked like old plaster. I set down my fork carefully. The restaurant noise faded until all I could hear was my pulse. Ethan, sitting quietly beside me, squeezed my hand under the table. "Don't," he whispered, but I had spent my entire life not saying things. My silence had built this version of me, obedient, useful, invisible. I looked up, voice steady. I didn't realize love came with an invoice. The table went still. My mother blinked, then smiled, that hostess smile again. "Oh, Isabel," she said sweetly, "you always did have a flair for drama." She turned to her friend, waving her manicured hand as though brushing away a speck of dust. "Ignore her. She's always been sensitive." The conversation resumed in fragments, awkward and hollow. I sat there, heart thudding, feeling something new settle inside me. Not rage, not humiliation, but clarity. After lunch, I offered to help the staff clear plates just to escape the table. The kitchen smelled of lemons and heat, the clang of dishes strangely comforting. I stacked plates quietly until I heard the familiar click of heels behind me. My mother's voice followed, low but sharp. "Don't you ever speak about money in front of my friends again?" I turned, meeting her gaze for once without flinching. "I paid for that lunch." She raised her eyebrows, unfazed. "And you should. You're lucky to even be here." "Lucky," I repeated softly, the word sour on my tongue. She stepped closer, lowering her voice. "You have no idea what it takes to keep this family respectable. You don't get to ruin it just because you're bitter." I felt my throat tighten, but I kept my tone calm. "Respect built on lies doesn't last, Mother." Her jaw stiffened. "Don't test me, Isabel." I smiled, then small and deliberate. "I think the testing's over." For a second, something flickered in her eyes. Confusion, maybe fear, but it vanished as quickly as it came. She turned on her heel and walked away. When I left the kitchen, the sunlight felt too bright. I walked past the tables without saying goodbye. Outside, the air smelled like sea salt and exhaust, the world painfully vivid after the suffocating sweetness inside. In the car, Ethan started the engine but didn't speak. I stared at my hands in my lap, noticing they were trembling. "You okay?" he asked quietly. I nodded, though it was a lie. "You heard what she said." I did. His voice was controlled, but there was fury beneath it. "You don't have to keep letting them do this." I exhaled, watching waves crash against the rocks beyond the parking lot. "It's not that simple." "Yes, it is," he said firmly. "They're using you, and you're paying them to do it." I turned to him, then meeting his eyes. There was no pity there, only conviction. "If love is a currency," I said softly, "I've been bankrupt since I was a kid." He reached for my hand again. "Then it's time to stop financing your pain." I didn't answer, but the words echoed in my head long after he pulled onto the highway. That night back in Portland, the apartment felt both too small and too quiet. The city lights shimmered outside our window, reflecting in the half-empty glass of wine on the counter. My phone buzzed, a text from Claire. The planner deposit cleared. "Thank you, Miss Monroe." I stared at it for a long time before laughing out loud. The sound startled even me. Ethan looked up from the couch. "What they want, perfection built on my account," I said, shaking my head. "Let them have it." He set his book down. "What are you going to do?" I walked to the window, pulling back the curtain to look at the streetlights below. "Maybe start designing something of my own this time." He came up behind me, wrapping his arms around my waist. "You mean a life?" I nodded. "Exactly that." When he went to bed, I stayed up, scrolling through the wedding photos. My mother had already begun posting on social media floral arrangements, smiling faces, captions like, "Love deserves a second chance." The comments were full of admiration. "You look radiant, Lydia." "What a beautiful family." Not one mention of the daughter behind the scenes. I clicked on the image, zooming in until I saw the sparkle of her diamond earrings, the way her hand rested possessively on my father's arm. She looked untouchable. But beneath that photo-perfect surface, I could almost feel the cracks. I closed my laptop and sat in the dark, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound. Every detail of that lunch replayed in my head: the laughter, the public humiliation, the way her voice had wrapped around the word lucky. For years I had believed her. I thought surviving her made me fortunate. But as I stared into the darkness, I realized she was right about one thing. I was lucky. Lucky to finally see her clearly. Lucky to have proof signed and sealed that every inch of her perfect world stood on the foundation I built. And luckiest of all, to know that if I ever chose to pull it out from under her, I wouldn't need to raise my voice. All I'd have to do was stop paying the bill. The thought was quiet, steady, and frighteningly simple. Before going to bed, I checked my email one last time. There it was, another invoice from the venue waiting for my approval. I hovered over the button marked Confirm Payment. My finger stopped an inch above it. I didn't click. Not yet. But for the first time in my life, I realized I didn't have to. The cafe smelled like cinnamon and old wood, the kind of scent that clung to your clothes long after you left. It was early morning, the streets of downtown Portland still slick from rain. I sat at a corner table with my laptop open, the wedding contracts glowing on the screen. Across from me, Ava Reynolds flipped through the printed copies I'd brought, her expression unreadable. She looked exactly as I remembered from college, sharp eyes. Deliberate movements, the kind of calm that made people confess things they hadn't planned to. Her nails tapped against the paper rhythmically as she read. "You weren't kidding," she said finally, glancing up. "Every one of these contracts is under your name." I sipped my coffee, which had long gone cold. I didn't realize it until 2 nights ago. I thought I was just helping. Paying deposits, signing forms. She said it was easier that way. Ava leaned back, folding her arms. "Easier for her, sure. You're the client of record. That means you hold every legal right over this entire wedding. The venue, the caterer, the florist, even the band, they all answer to you." The words felt heavy and dangerous, like something that could shatter if I touched it wrong. "So what you're saying is..." I'm saying, Ava interrupted, you could cancel the entire thing tomorrow, and there's nothing they could do about it. I stared at her. The cafe's hum faded until all I could hear was the faint buzz of electricity in the overhead lights. If I did that, it would destroy them. She nodded slowly. It would. But after what they've done, are you sure? That's not justice. The word tasted strange, like a foreign language I'd never learned to speak. I had spent my whole life chasing peace, not justice. I don't want to ruin them, I said quietly. I just want it to stop. Ava tilted her head. Then stop it. Power doesn't have to scream to be heard, Izzy. She paused, her gaze softening. You've been manipulated for years. This is the first time you hold the reins. Use them. The rain started again outside, tapping softly against the window. I looked down at the signature line on one of the documents, my name in black ink, small but final. For so long that name had been tied to debts, disappointments, and guilt. Now it meant authority. Ava's phone buzzed and she glanced at it briefly before setting it aside. There's another thing. Monroe Holdings, right. The family trust account your father set up years ago, I nodded. It's joint. Him, my mother, and me. She smiled slightly. Then that's the lever, I frowned. What do you mean in Oregon? Any joint account holder can request a temporary freeze if there's suspicion of misuse or unauthorized transactions. It's not a full seizure, it just stops outgoing payments until an internal review clears things. I blinked. So if I file a freeze? Ava's eyes met mine. Every check your parents write bounces. Every vendor waiting for payment gets stalled. The wedding halts instantly. The idea made my pulse quicken. That would humiliate them. She shrugged. Sometimes the truth comes with noise. I pushed my coffee aside, hands trembling slightly. They'd never forgive me. When Ava said gently, "Have they ever forgiven you for anything?" the question hit me harder than I expected. I stared out the window as the rain streaked down the glass, blurring the shapes of people hurrying along the sidewalk. For a moment, I saw my mother's reflection. Instead, her perfectly painted smile, her hands reaching for control that was no longer hers. "Can you draft the paperwork?" I asked. My voice didn't sound like mine. "I already did," Ava said, sliding a folder across the table. "You just have to sign." I laughed softly. "Of course you did." She smiled. "You were always smart enough to build your own safety net. You just needed to believe you could use it." When she left, the seat across from me felt too empty. I stayed there for a long time, staring at the folder. My reflection wavered in the glossy cover, ghost-like fragile. Outside, the sky brightened just enough to turn the rain silver. I gathered my things and stepped out into the chill air, the folder tucked under my arm. My hands shook as I walked toward my car, not from fear this time, but from adrenaline. Halfway home, I pulled over near the river. The water moved slow and heavy, under the bridge, dark and steady. I thought about my mother's voice telling me to apologize, to stay quiet, to keep the peace. I thought about the years I'd spent cleaning up her messes, paying her debts, pretending not to notice how she twisted the knife every time I tried to stand tall. Maybe peace wasn't the opposite of conflict. Maybe peace was the absence of control. That night I called Ethan. He answered on the first ring. "Did you talk to her?" "Yes," I said, setting the folder on the kitchen counter. "And she says I have full control. Everything contracts, payments, the joint accounts. If I want to, I can stop it all." He was quiet for a moment. "What's stopping you?" "I'm scared," I admitted. "Not of them. Of what it means if I do this. If I finally stop pretending." He came over not long after, carrying takeout and a bottle of wine. We sat on the couch, food untouched. The city lights outside glowed against the rain-slick windows. "You don't have to become them to take your life back," he said softly. "You just have to stop giving them your permission to hurt you." I met his eyes. "They'll hate me." He smiled sadly. "They already do. At least this way you get something out of it." I laughed, but it cracked halfway through. "You make it sound easy." "It isn't," he said. "But it's necessary." Later, when he fell asleep beside me, I got up quietly and went to the kitchen. The folder waited under the lamp, its edges sharp in the light. I opened it and stared at the first page, temporary freeze request. Ava's note was clipped to the top sign electronically when ready. I ran my fingers over the line where my name would go. A memory flashed me at 12 years old, writing "I'm sorry" on a crumpled sheet of paper after my mother accused me of breaking her vase. I'd left it on her dresser with flowers I'd picked from the yard. She never said a word. The next morning, the note was gone. Now my hand hovered above a different kind of paper, the adult version of an apology I didn't owe. I clicked the pen open, hesitated, then closed it again. My reflection in the window met my eyes, older, steadier, but still that same girl waiting for permission. Enough. I picked up my laptop and opened the email Ava had sent. The signature field blinked, waiting. My heart thudded once, twice, then I typed my name. The confirmation icon flashed. The file saved automatically. Just like that, it was done. No thunder, no lightning. Just the hum of the refrigerator and the faint sound of rain against the window. I sat back, breathing hard. The silence felt new, different. Not heavy, not suffocating. Just mine. I thought about what Ava had said earlier, that power didn't have to scream to be heard. Maybe she was right. My whole life had been an apology I didn't owe. But tonight, with a single signature, I'd finally answered in the only language they would understand. When I turned off the light, the house stayed quiet. The rain eased into a whisper. Somewhere across the city, a file had already gone through the system, triggering notifications, halting transactions, freezing the money that had always been theirs. Never mine. For the first time in my life, my silence wasn't surrender. It was control, and I had never felt more awake. The diner looked smaller than I remembered. The paint on the sign had faded, the neon letters buzzing faintly in the afternoon light. The golden fork. Every Sunday after church, we'd come here as a family. Pancakes for Brandon, omelets for my father, black coffee for my mother, and whatever scraps of attention were left for me. I hadn't stepped inside in over a decade. Now I stood at the door again, heart-hammering, staring through the window at the people waiting for me. My mother sat with her back perfectly straight, her pale hair pinned up in that careful, practiced way. My father was beside her, flipping through his phone, his tie loosened, but his control still intact. Across from them, Brandon scrolled absently, a grin twitching at his mouth. When the hostess motioned for me to follow, I forced my legs to move. The smell of coffee and fried bacon wrapped around me like old ghosts. My mother looked up first, that thin, deliberate smile stretching across her face. "You came," she said, her tone halfway between surprise and triumph. I slid into the booth opposite them, smoothing my palms on my jeans. "You asked for me." Brandon leaned back in his seat. "Guess miracles do happen." "Brandon," my father warned without looking up, his voice the same even monotone that had silenced entire rooms when we were children. My mother folded her napkin neatly on her lap. "We don't need drama, Isabel. This is supposed to be civil." "Civil," I repeated, letting the words settle between us. That's one way to describe it. The waitress came by, refilled their coffees, and gave me a small smile that felt too kind for the moment. I ordered tea just to have something to hold. My mother started as I knew she would. "We simply want things to go smoothly. The wedding is only a week away, and your attitude has nothing to do with your wedding," I interrupted quietly. "Except that you made sure I wouldn't be welcome," she blinked, offended. "You chose to make yourself unwelcome. All we asked for was an apology. For existing," I asked. My voice was calm, too calm. "For paying for every deposit? For signing every contract?" My father's head lifted, then eyes narrowing. "We agreed to repay you." When I said, leaning forward, "Before or after the part where you banned me from your guest list?" Brandon snorted. "Here we go, the victim speech." I turned to him slowly. "You think this is about attention," he smirked. "Isn't it always? You love being the problem. It's your thing." The air between us thickened, heat creeping up my neck. I wanted to stand to leave, but something in me, something older and stronger, kept me still. I reached into my bag and pulled out the folder. The sound of it hitting the table cut through the hum of the diner. My mother's gaze flicked to it, curious. "What's that?" "The contracts," I said. "All of them." Her lips curved in amusement. "You brought paperwork to lunch," I met her eyes. "You might want to look closely before you keep talking about what I owe you." I opened the folder and slid one document across the table, the venue agreement. Her name was nowhere on it, neither was my father's. Just mine, printed neatly at the bottom, next to the words, "Authorized by Isabel Monroe." My mother's hand froze halfway to her coffee cup. "What are you doing?" I pushed another page toward her catering flowers photography music. "All the same, every contract," I said softly, "every deposit, every detail that makes your perfect day possible. It's all under my name." For a heartbeat, no one spoke. Then my father chuckled low and dismissive. "So, you helped. That doesn't make you in charge." "Actually," I said, "it does. Legally, I'm the client. Without my approval, none of these services can proceed." Brandon leaned forward, incredulous. "You wouldn't dare." I looked at him steady. "You're right. I wouldn't dare if I still cared about earning their approval." My mother found her voice brittle and sharp. "You're bluffing." I reached for the last paper in the folder and slid it toward her, a single-page notice signed by Ava Reynolds. The heading read, "Temporary Financial Freeze Authorization, Monroe Holdings." The color drained from her face. My father's jaw tightened. Brandon's smirk vanished. My voice stayed calm. "I filed this 2 days ago. The account is frozen pending review. Any payments linked to it will be paused until the investigation clears." My mother's fingers curled around her napkin, knuckles whitening. "You ungrateful child. We gave you everything." I shook my head. "You gave me debt. You gave me guilt. And you called it love." The waitress appeared again, oblivious to the tension, asking if we wanted refills. My mother waved her away sharply. The woman hesitated, then walked off, glancing back once with a worried frown. My father leaned forward, lowering his voice. "We're family, Isabel. You don't humiliate family in public." I met his gaze steady. "You already did that to me years ago. I'm just returning what was left behind." Brandon slammed his palm against the table. "You're insane. You just want attention." "No," I said, voice quiet but sharp enough to cut through his shouting. "I want peace. And if that costs you your perfect wedding, then so be it." My mother stood suddenly, her chair scraping against the floor. "If you go through with this, you're no longer my daughter." The words didn't sting the way they used to. They just landed flat like an old song I'd heard too many times. I picked up the folder, slid the papers back inside, and rose slowly. "Then, I guess that makes it official." I dropped a few bills on the table for my tea. "Lunch is on me," I said, almost smiling. Her eyes followed me, cold and furious. My father looked like he wanted to speak, but couldn't find the right words. Brandon muttered something under his breath, but I didn't stop to hear it. The bell above the door jingled as I stepped outside. The sun was brighter than I expected, reflecting off the chrome of parked cars. The world went on indifferent to the small explosion I'd left behind. Ethan was waiting across the street, leaning against his car. When he saw me, he straightened, searching my face. "How did it go?" I crossed the street. Slowly, the folder tucked under my arm. "They think I'm bluffing." He opened the car door for me, his voice low. "Are you?" I looked out toward the road where the diner's neon sign flickered weakly in the distance. "Not anymore." We drove in silence for a while, the sound of tires on asphalt filling the car. My hands rested in my lap, steady now. The tremor I'd carried my whole life was gone. Ethan glanced over. "You okay?" I nodded. For the first time, yeah. He reached across the console and took my hand. "You know this means war, right?" I smiled faintly. "It was always war. I just stopped pretending it was a family dinner." The city blurred past sunlight flashing between buildings. I thought about the diner, about my mother's face, when she saw her empire crack, about the way her voice trembled for the first time. She'd built her life around control, and now for the first time she'd realized she couldn't control me. When we pulled into the apartment garage, Ethan turned off the engine but didn't move. "What now?" I looked at the folder in my lap. "Now," I said, "we wait for the silence to do its work." He smiled slightly. "You really think silence is enough?" I met his eyes. "It's all they ever taught me. I'm just finally using it right." That night, I sat on the balcony watching the city lights flicker like stars that had forgotten how to shine. The air smelled of rain and concrete. Somewhere below, a siren wailed and faded. I thought of the little girl who used to sit in that same diner waiting for her mother to smile at her. The same girl who once believed that if she stayed quiet, she might finally be loved. I took a deep breath and let it out slowly. "You can stop waiting now," I whispered to her. Inside, Ethan was making tea. The sound of the kettle whistling was steady grounding. I looked down at my phone, no new messages, no missed calls, just the calm before the storm. I smiled faintly to myself. For years they had taught me to bow my head. Now they would learn what it felt like when I finally stood tall. The rain had turned the city into a blur of lights and reflections, the kind of night where everything looked softer than it really was. I sat by the window of our apartment, laptop open, watching the blue glow from the screen spill across the table. Ava's email was short, efficient, and terrifyingly calm. "Freeze process initiated. Temporary hold on Monroe Holdings funds pending verification." I read it twice, then a third time, the words sinking in like stones dropped into still water. It was done. The account was frozen. My parents' empire built on manipulation and image was locked. The realization didn't bring joy. It brought stillness. The kind of silence that follows a long storm when you're not sure if it's really over. Ethan came out of the bedroom barefoot, a sweater hanging loose over his shoulders. "You're still up," he said softly. I turned the screen toward him. "It's official." He glanced at the email, then back at me. "So it started. They'll know within 2 days." I rubbed my temples, the faint beginnings of a headache blooming behind my eyes. "By the time they try to pay another vendor, the system will flag it." Ethan leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "How does it feel?" I looked out the window, watching the rain drip down the glass. Like I just pulled the plug on my own history. He came closer, placing a hand on my shoulder. "You didn't kill it, Izzy. You just stopped feeding it." I let out a shaky laugh. "Tell that to the part of me that still feels guilty. You've spent your whole life cleaning up their messes. It's okay to leave one behind." I smiled faintly. He always made it sound simple, like the world didn't weigh on him the way it did on me. But I couldn't shake the image of my mother's face when she realized the truth. The shock, the fury, the humiliation. I had imagined it so many times, but now that it was inevitable, it didn't taste like victory. It tasted like freedom mixed with ash. The next morning, Ava called. "It's official," she said without preamble. "The funds are frozen pending audit. They'll get notified by tomorrow morning at the latest." I stood by the window watching clouds shift over the skyline. "Will they know it's me?" She hesitated. "They'll assume. But legally, I filed under your name. That means all communication routes through me. If they contact you, don't engage." "Understood." Her voice softened. "Izzy, I know this isn't easy, but you did the right thing. They've been using your money and your silence for years. It's about time they met both on your terms." After we hung up, I sat at the table scrolling through the endless chain of wedding emails. Each one looked so cheerful, subject lines filled with words like confirmation, celebration, joy. I opened one from the florist, then another from the caterer. Each invoice bore my name. The realization hit again and again. I was the architect of their illusion, and now I was dismantling it one email at a time. That night, I drafted messages to every vendor involved. Due to an internal audit, all pending payments for the Monroe event are temporarily suspended until further notice. Please await confirmation before proceeding. I copied Ava on each one, my fingers trembling slightly with every send. When the last message went out, I stared at my inbox, watching the cascade of automated replies. Out-of-office notices, polite acknowledgments, and one confused florist asking, "Should we hold the shipment of orchids?" "Yes," I whispered to the screen. "Hold everything." Ethan came home late from work and found me surrounded by papers and cold coffee cups. "You've been at this all day," he said, setting his keys down. "It's more complicated than I thought. Every contract has layers." He didn't realize how many people were involved. He crouched beside me, his hand resting gently on my knee. "You're not fixing it, Izzy. You're freeing yourself from it. There's a difference." "I know," I said quietly. "It just feels strange doing something that hurts them, even if it's right." He looked at me, eyes steady. "They've never hesitated to hurt you. Why are you still protecting them?" I didn't answer. Because deep down I knew why. It wasn't loyalty. It was conditioning. The same voice that had told me to stay quiet, to forgive, to endure, still whispered that standing up for myself was cruel. But I was tired of being the family's soft landing. A few days passed. The city shifted from rain to crisp winter sunlight. I went to work, answered emails, smiled through meetings. On the surface, nothing had changed. Inside, everything had. By Thursday afternoon, the first sign of fallout appeared. Ava texted. "They tried to make a payment to the caterer. It bounced. You'll probably get a call soon." My phone rang 2 hours later. My mother's number lit up the screen. I stared at it until it stopped ringing. A minute later, a voicemail came through. Her voice was tight, brittle, with controlled fury. "Isabel, there's some kind of issue with the bank. The florist is calling me about a delay. If you've done something, fix it immediately. This wedding will not be ruined because of your stubbornness." I listened to the message twice, then deleted it. That night, I cooked dinner with Ethan, the smell of garlic and rosemary filling the kitchen. "She called," I said quietly. He paused mid-stir. "And she's panicking." He smiled faintly. "Good." I shook my head. "It's not good. It's just sad." She built her entire identity on pretending everything was perfect. Without control, she's nothing. "Maybe that's her lesson to learn," he said softly. "And yours is realizing you don't have to be her student anymore." We ate in silence, the tension settling into something softer, almost fragile. When I went to bed, I dreamed of waves breaking against glass walls, shattering into foam. By Friday, Ava sent another update. "Vendors have paused all services." The planner reached out for clarification. "I've informed her to direct all questions to me." The next line made me stop breathing. "Your mother called the bank this morning. She knows." I stared at the text, my pulse quickening. I could picture the scene, her standing in her kitchen, the morning light, catching her diamond earrings, fury simmering under that calm exterior. She'd probably accused everyone of betrayal before realizing the truth. I didn't reply to Ava. Instead, I opened my browser and bought 2 plane tickets to Bora Bora. The wedding was a week away. I wasn't going to be anywhere near it. When Ethan came home that night, I handed him the printed confirmations. "We're leaving next Tuesday." He looked at the tickets, then at me. "You're serious?" "I'm done watching her play God with my life. She wants a perfect wedding. She can have it without me and without her money." He laughed softly, pulling me into his arms. "You really are something else." "Don't give me too much credit," I murmured against his shoulder. "I'm just tired of bleeding for people who call it love." Over the weekend, I tied up loose ends. I canceled automatic payments, rerouted my emails, set an out-of-office message at work. Each small act felt like another thread snapping loose from the web they'd built around me. On Sunday night, I sat on the balcony watching the city lights flicker against the dark river. Ava called one last time. "Everything's in place. Once they try to access the funds again, they'll get a final notification. You don't need to respond to anything." "Thank you," I said softly. She hesitated. "You. Okay." I smiled faintly. "I don't know. But I'm finally still." When I hung up, I looked at the plane tickets sitting on the table, the names printed clearly: Isabel Monroe and Ethan Clark. Bora Bora. 10 days. The idea of warmth and quiet waves felt like another life. Ethan came out onto the balcony with 2 mugs of tea. "You did it," he said, handing one to me. "Not yet," I whispered. "But soon." The air smelled like rain and salt, a mix that felt like both endings and beginnings. He raised his cup. "To silence that finally means peace." I clinked my mug against his. "To peace that doesn't require forgiveness." The city below us hummed indifferent and alive. Somewhere across the state, my parents were realizing the first cracks in their perfect facade. But here, under the quiet Portland sky, I felt something I hadn't in years: freedom blooming quietly inside me, like a tide that had finally turned in my favor. The morning of the wedding dawned bright and merciless over Santa Barbara. The sky was a watercolor of blue and gold, the kind of day my mother had prayed for. The kind of day she would tell everyone she deserved. Across town, the Monroe beachfront villa stood ready for its grand performance, white tents gleaming in the sun, hundreds of chairs lined up in perfect symmetry. But beneath the satin and the sparkle, the machinery had already stopped working. The wires were cut. The accounts were frozen. The stage was set for a show that would never begin. Meanwhile, I stood in line at the Los Angeles International Airport, passport in hand, the hum of travelers surrounding me, like a strange kind of music. Ethan stood beside me, his hand resting lightly at the small of my back. I checked my phone one last time. 53 missed calls. 12 voicemails. 4 new messages from my mother, all variations of rage and panic. "Don't look at it," Ethan murmured, sliding the phone from my hand. I smiled weakly. "She's probably standing in her wedding gown right now, wondering why the band hasn't shown up." He leaned close, whispering, "And we'll be somewhere over the Pacific by the time she figures out why." When our boarding group was called, I hesitated for a heartbeat. Leaving had always been the hardest part. But this time, I wasn't leaving home, I was leaving the battlefield. I took a deep breath and stepped forward. The plane lifted off 30 minutes later, the city shrinking below us until it looked unreal. I stared out the window as the coast disappeared beneath a blanket of clouds. My chest felt hollow, like something inside me had been emptied out but not lost, freed. Ethan squeezed my hand. "You okay?" I nodded, watching the sunlight spill across the wings. "For the first time, I think I am." Somewhere down there, guests were beginning to arrive at the villa, their luxury cars pulling into the circular drive, champagne flutes waiting on silver trays. The staff moved nervously, checking lists that no longer mattered. The florist called the planner called the caterer called the bank, and the bank had only one thing to say: transaction denied. I pictured my mother standing on the terrace, confusion clouding her perfect face. My father at her side, phone pressed to his ear, jaw tightening. The ripple of whispers spreading through the guests as realization dawned. I could almost hear the first shout, the first accusation. Who did this? The thought didn't make me laugh. It made me quiet. The flight was long and gentle. Hours passed in a rhythm of clouds and silence. At one point, Ethan brushed his thumb across my wrist and said, "You know, somewhere right now she's screaming about orchids." I chuckled softly. "She probably thinks the florist betrayed her." "Maybe she did," he said with a grin. "Just not in the way your mom thinks." I leaned my head against his shoulder, closing my eyes. Let her have her drama. I'm done starring in it. When we landed in Tahiti, the sun was setting in ribbons of gold and coral. We boarded a smaller plane to Bora Bora, and from there a boat that glided over turquoise water so clear it looked unreal. I could see the coral beneath us glowing like jewels. The resort staff greeted us with warm smiles, flower garlands, and glasses of cool fruit juice. Ethan signed the forms, while I stood there dazed by the light, the color, the quiet. Every sound was soft here: the lapping of water, the brush of wind through palms. For a moment, I couldn't remember the last time I'd felt this safe. Our bungalow stood above the water, its deck opening to an endless horizon. I slipped off my shoes and walked barefoot across the wooden planks. The ocean stretched out before me, infinite and calm. Behind me, Ethan's laughter mingled with the sound of waves. When I checked my phone again, the service was weak, but a dozen new messages had somehow made it through. I opened one from Ava first. "They know, everything's unraveling. The vendors have all pulled out. The planner's trying to reach you, but I told her you're unavailable." The next was from my mother. "You are dead to me." The words blinked back at me, sharp and venomous. But I didn't feel pain this time, just release. For years, she had used silence as punishment. Now silence belonged to me. I put the phone face down on the table. Ethan came up behind me, arms wrapping around my waist. "Don't let her ruin this moment." "I'm not," I whispered. "I think this is the first moment she doesn't own." The sky darkened into a velvet blue. We had dinner on the deck, grilled fish rice and cold wine. The ocean shimmered under the lantern light, and for the first time I tasted food without guilt. Somewhere far away, the Monroe wedding had become a disaster. Guests left confused and angry. The planner wept into her phone. My father tried to negotiate with vendors who refused to deliver. My mother stood in her designer gown, clutching her pearls, demanding explanations no one could give. I should have felt satisfaction. Instead, what I felt was quiet, not triumph, peace. Ethan poured another glass of wine and raised it toward me. "To freedom," he said softly. I clinked my glass against his. Two endings that finally make sense. The next morning, the sunlight woke me early. The world outside was impossibly bright, waves lapping softly against the stilt, seabirds circling in the distance. I made coffee and sat cross-legged on the deck, a journal in my lap. For years I had written only to make sense of pain. Now I wrote just to fill the silence. I wrote about the diner, about my mother's glare, about the weight that lifted when I realized I no longer needed her approval. I wrote about the girl I used to be, the one who cleaned floors while her family went on vacations, the one who thought love meant debt. And then I wrote about the woman sitting here now, breathing the air of freedom she'd paid for herself. When Ethan came out, hair tousled, carrying 2 cups of coffee, he kissed my temple. "What are you writing, a eulogy?" I said with a small smile. He looked amused. "For who?" "For the daughter who thought she had to earn her parents' love." He sat beside me, sipping his coffee. "She deserves a good send-off." By afternoon, my phone was full again. News alerts, messages, even a headline, "The wedding that never happened." There was a photo of the villa gates, locked guests milling about, the caption describing unforeseen financial complications. I showed it to Ethan and he laughed softly. "Karma's efficient these days." I set the phone down again. "I don't feel proud." "You're not supposed to," he said. "You're supposed to feel free." And I did. That evening we walked along the shore, the sand cool beneath our feet. The sun slipped into the ocean like it had been waiting for this all along. I looked out over the water and whispered, "She'll never forgive me." Ethan laced his fingers through mine, then stopped, waiting for her to. The waves moved around our ankles, washing away our footprints almost instantly. I realized how much I liked the idea of impermanence, of letting things go without trying to preserve them. When we got back to the bungalow, I turned off my phone completely and left it in a drawer. The night air smelled of salt and hibiscus. The only sound was the steady rhythm of the waves. We lay down together, the ceiling fans spinning lazily above us. My thoughts drifted to the chaos, back home. The broken perfection, the ruined wedding, the mother who had finally been forced to live without control. For years I had begged for forgiveness from people who never planned to give it. Now for the first time I understood I didn't need it. I didn't need apologies or reconciliation or revenge, just distance. As I drifted towards sleep, the waves outside whispered against the posts of the bungalow, soft and rhythmic. Ethan's breathing evened beside me and the world felt still. Tomorrow would come with its own noise, emails, questions, rumors. But tonight the ocean sang a different kind of truth. I was not my mother's shadow. I was not her disappointment, her scapegoat, her unpaid debt. I was simply free. The morning light in Bora Bora was soft and gold, the kind that blurred the edges of everything it touched. I sat on the deck with a cup of coffee legs folded under me, watching sunlight spill across the water. The waves moved slow and gentle, like time itself had stopped. For the first time in my life, I didn't wake up bracing for someone else's anger. I woke up to silence that was mine. Ethan came out, his hair still damp from the shower, holding his phone. "You might want to see this," he said quietly. On the screen was a headline from a California news site, "The Wedding That Never Happened." Beneath it, a photo of my mother, in her wedding dress, white satin, flawless makeup, the look of a woman trying not to cry in public. The caption read, "Lavish beachfront wedding cancelled amid alleged financial confusion. Guests left in chaos." My chest tightened. There it was, the story I'd written without words. My mother, Lydia Monroe, the woman who built her life on appearances, now reduced to a headline about failure. Ethan sat beside me, handing over the phone. It's everywhere. Social media, gossip sites, even a financial blog. I scrolled through the article. Guests described confusion, vendors refused entry without payment confirmation. The planner nearly fainted when the bank declined all transactions. One line stopped me cold. Sources claim the bride's daughter, previously excluded from the event, was responsible for the financial freeze. Ethan watched my face. "You're trending." I set the phone down. "I didn't mean for this to go public." He reached for my hand. "You didn't leak it. The truth just got tired of hiding." I looked out at the horizon where the ocean met the sky in a seamless blur. "It doesn't feel good," I whispered. "It's not supposed to," he said softly. "It's justice, not joy." The wind shifted, carrying the scent of salt and something sweet, plumeria maybe. For a long time we just sat there, letting the quiet fill the spaces where guilt tried to creep in. Later, as the sun climbed higher, I opened my phone again. Ava had sent a short message. "It's done. They know everything. You're in the clear legally." Below her text were screenshots of headlines. One called it "The Fall of the Monroe Empire." Another said "Bride Left Broke at the Altar." My stomach twisted. I wasn't built for cruelty. Even when they'd earned it, seeing their humiliation splashed across the internet made me ache in a way I didn't expect. I closed my eyes and saw her face the day I told her no, how her mouth had trembled before turning into a smirk. She had never believed I would follow through. Now she knew. I stood and walked to the edge of the deck, toes curling against the warm wood. The water below shimmered, reflecting the sun like liquid glass. Ethan came up behind me, his hands sliding around my waist. "She'll call," he murmured. "I know. Are you going to answer?" I shook my head. "Not this time." We spent the afternoon wandering along the beach, the sound of the waves washing over our footsteps. The world here was quiet, disconnected. Each step felt like shedding something invisible but heavy. By the time we returned to the bungalow, my phone was full of missed calls. My father, my brother, even a few relatives I hadn't spoken to in years. And then there was the voicemail from her. I pressed play. Her voice was brittle, cracking beneath forced composure. "How could you do this to me?" "To us." Everyone saw what happened. Reporters called the house. "Do you understand what you've done?" A sharp breath. "Your father left. He couldn't face anyone. I hope you're happy." The line went silent for a few seconds. Then she spoke again, her tone smaller, almost desperate. "You've humiliated me. I loved you despite everything. You've destroyed this family." I deleted it before she could finish. Ethan was sitting across the room watching me carefully. "That was her, wasn't it?" "Yes. And she's still rewriting the story," I said. "Only this time I'm not in it." He crossed the room and sat beside me, taking my hand. "You don't owe her anything, not even anger." I leaned into him, the exhaustion hitting all at once. "Then why does it still hurt?" "Because you're human," he said softly. "You loved someone who never knew how to love you back." The next morning, the story had grown. A local news station ran an interview with one of the guests, a woman from my mother's church group. Lydia always wanted things her way, the woman said. Maybe this is karma. Karma. The word stuck with me all day. I didn't believe in vengeance dressed as destiny, but something about that phrase felt true. Not cruel, balanced. That afternoon, Ava called. You've become a legend, she said dryly. I've had 3 clients mention you as inspiration for taking control of their lives. I groaned. God, please don't tell me I've become a cautionary tale. Not cautionary, she said. Liberating. Though your mother probably doesn't see it that way. Any word from her lawyer, they won't pursue anything. The paperwork was airtight. The bank confirmed you acted within your rights. She might scream, but she can't sue. Good, I said, though my voice felt hollow. Ava hesitated. Izzy, I know it's complicated, but you did the right thing. Don't let guilt rewrite that. After we hung up, I went for a swim. The water was clear and cool, the sunlight breaking into prisms around me. For a moment, I let myself sink beneath the surface, eyes open, the world above turning into ripples of gold and blue. When I came up for air, I felt lighter. That evening, Ethan and I sat by the water as the sun went down, our feet buried in the sand. The horizon flamed orange, the ocean turning to liquid fire. To endings, he said, raising his glass. To beginnings, I replied. We clinked glasses, and for the first time the toast didn't feel like pretending. Later, lying in bed, I opened my phone one last time. There was a message from an unfamiliar number. Your mother's finally speaking to the press. She's saying it was a clerical mistake. I smiled faintly. Of course she was. Control had always been her oxygen. Even stripped bare, she'd find a way to pretend she was still queen. I typed a reply to Ava, let her have her story. I've written my own. When I put the phone down, Ethan turned toward me, his eyes soft in the lamplight. You think she'll ever understand? No, I said, closing my eyes. But I don't need her to. The night outside was calm, the tide rolling in and out in perfect rhythm. I listened to the waves until my thoughts began to blur. Before I drifted to sleep, one final thought settled quietly in my mind. All my life I'd mistaken forgiveness for freedom. But lying there miles away from the wreckage, I finally understood they were never the same thing. Freedom wasn't the absence of pain. It was the decision to stop letting pain define you. And that at last was mine. 2 weeks after the wedding that never happened, the plane touched down in Portland under a slate-gray sky. Raindrops streaked across the window as the engines quieted, the kind of steady Oregon drizzle that made everything look softer, quieter. Ethan reached for my hand, squeezing once before we stood to leave. My heart felt strangely calm, heavier in some places, lighter in others. I wasn't returning home to apologize. I was coming back to rebuild. Outside the terminal, the air smelled of wet pavement and cedar. The city looked the same skyline, same streets, but it didn't feel the same. It was like walking through a place that once haunted me and realizing the ghosts had lost their power. Ethan loaded our bags into the back of a taxi while I scrolled through my phone. Dozens of unread messages. Family acquaintances, old neighbors, even journalists, asking for my side of the story. I didn't open a single one. Back in our apartment, I set my suitcase down and stood by the window, watching the city breathe beneath a veil of mist. Ethan came up behind me, wrapping his arms around my shoulders. You sure you're ready to see them again? He asked. I shook my head. I'm not going to see them. I'm just going to see what's left. The next morning, I walked to the corner cafe I used to visit before work. The barista recognized me instantly. You're back, she said, smiling. Haven't seen you in months. Yeah, I said, smiling faintly. Had to go sort a few things out. She didn't ask what. I was grateful for that. When I sat by the window with my coffee, I noticed a woman at the next table glance at me over her newspaper. Her expression flickered with recognition before she quickly looked away. I knew that look. Pity mixed with curiosity. People love a scandal they can feel good about judging. I took a sip of my coffee and smiled to myself. Let them talk. The truth had never needed an audience. Later that afternoon, I met Aunt Margaret. She called the night before, her voice hesitant but kind. "I think it's time we talk," she'd said. "I should have done it years ago." We met at a small cafe tucked between two bookstores, a quiet place that smelled of rain and baked bread. She looked older than I remembered, her hair streaked with silver, her eyes soft but weary. When she saw me, she stood arms open. "Isabel," she said, her voice breaking a little, "you look stronger." I hugged her, breathing in the familiar scent of rose perfume. "I finally feel it," I said. We sat across from each other, steam curling from our cups. "I saw what happened," she said. "The papers, the interviews. Lydia's been telling everyone it was a misunderstanding." "Of course she has," I said quietly. "Control is her religion." Aunt Margaret sighed, stirring her tea. "I wish I'd said something back then. When you were younger. When she started turning you into the villain. You didn't owe me that," I said. "You were surviving her too in your own way." Tears welled in her eyes. "I was a coward." "No," I said softly. "You were kind. Kindness doesn't always roar." For the first time, someone from my family didn't defend my mother. Didn't tell me to forgive and forget. She just sat there holding my hand and said, "You did what I never could. You stopped her." We talked for over an hour about childhood memories, about my father's silence, about how the Monroe name had become a cage we were all born into. When we finally stood to leave, she pulled me into another hug. "She might never understand what you did," she whispered. "But one day she'll have to live with it." "Maybe that's enough," I said. The next few days passed quietly. Ava sent me documents confirming that Monroe Holdings had been dissolved. The accounts closed, the debts cleared. I was for the first time legally and financially free. I printed the final letter and set it in a small wooden box on my desk. On the lid, I wrote 3 words in black ink: "Lessons learned." That night, I lit a candle and sat by the window with my journal. The city lights shimmered like stars reflected in puddles. I wrote, "Freedom doesn't come with fanfare. It arrives quietly, like forgiveness you give yourself." When I closed the journal, Ethan was standing in the doorway smiling. "You really are an architect," he said softly. "Even your piece has a blueprint." I laughed. "Maybe that's my next project." A few days later, I ran into Brandon at the grocery store. He was standing near the checkout, staring at his phone, a half-empty cart in front of him. He looked tired, dark circles under his eyes, the careless charm that once made him untouchable now dulled. When he saw me, his expression flickered between shock and shame. "Isabel," he said finally. "Wow. I didn't think you'd come back." I finished for him. He nodded. "Mom's not talking to anyone. Dad moved to Arizona. People won't stop asking questions." "I'm sure they won't," I said calmly. He shifted awkwardly, rubbing the back of his neck. "She says you destroyed everything." I met his eyes, steady and unflinching. "No, Brandon. I just stopped pretending everything was fine." He looked away, his throat working as if he wanted to say more but couldn't. As I picked up my bag, I added, "You can keep the family name. I'll build my own." He nodded weakly. "Good luck, Izzy." When I walked out of the store, the sky had started to clear. The rain had washed the city clean. A week later, I stood in front of a freshly painted sign outside a small office downtown, "Isabel Monroe Studio." Beneath it, in smaller letters, "Designing Freedom." Ethan stood beside me, holding 2 cups of coffee. "You really did it," he said. I looked at the new sign, the soft glow of light reflecting off the windows. "I had to," I said. "If I could design homes for other people, I could design a life for myself." We stepped inside, the smell of fresh paint still strong, the desks bare and waiting. The future for once didn't scare me. It felt like an open floor plan, clean, bright, endless possibilities. As the sun set, I stood by the window watching people hurry home through the fading light. Somewhere out there, my mother was still spinning her story. But for the first time, I didn't need to correct it. The truth had already done its work. Ethan came up behind me, slipping an arm around my waist. "You know," he said, "you never needed their forgiveness. You just needed your own." I smiled, leaning into him. Maybe forgiveness was never the point. Maybe it was about remembering who I was before they told me who to be. Outside, the city glowed softly, the rain starting again, gentle cleansing, unafraid. I took a deep breath, letting it fill my lungs, my chest, my heart. They tried to erase me from their story, I said quietly. But I wrote my own, and it's still standing. Ethan pressed a kiss to my temple. To new blueprints, he whispered. To new foundations, I said, smiling. For the first time, I felt completely steady. The walls of the past had fallen, and in their place stood something stronger. My own life, my own name, built not from guilt or apology, but from choice. A year later, the rain in Portland felt gentler, softer somehow, the kind that didn't sting when it touched your skin. I stood by the window of my new studio, watching droplets roll down the glass, leaving tiny silver trails behind. The sign outside glowed faintly against the gray afternoon, Isabel Monroe Studio, designing freedom. It still felt strange to see my name there, not as someone's daughter or scapegoat, but as my own person. Inside, sunlight filtered through wide glass panels, landing on sketches pinned to the wall. Most of them were part of a housing project I'd started 6 months ago, affordable homes designed for women rebuilding after loss, divorce, financial ruin, grief. The kind of women who knew what it was like to start from ashes. Every design was open, filled with light breathing space where pain used to live. I used to think revenge was the only way to reclaim power. But standing there surrounded by the evidence of my own growth, I realized it wasn't revenge I had built. It was peace. The mail arrived around noon, a small pile of envelopes bound with a rubber band. I flipped through bills, catalogs, and then froze. One envelope was handwritten, no return address. My heart stuttered when I saw the familiar curve of the letters. I sat down slowly, the sound of rain filling the silence. The handwriting was unmistakable. My mother's. Inside was a single sheet of cream-colored paper. The ink was faint, the words uneven, like her hand had trembled while writing them. You may hate me, but I hope you find peace. I never knew how to love you right. That was it. No apology. No excuses. Just those 2 sentences. I sat there for a long time, the paper trembling between my fingers. I didn't feel anger or even pity. I just felt still, like something that had been holding me in place for years had finally loosened its grip. I folded the note carefully and slipped it into the wooden box on my desk, the same one labeled Lessons Learned. Closing the lid felt like closing a book that had been left open too long. You were right about one thing, Mom, I whispered to the quiet room. Peace isn't given. It's built. That evening I met Aunt Margaret at a small cafe tucked between 2 bookstores downtown. The smell of fresh bread and coffee made the air warm, comforting. She waved when she saw me, her smile soft and familiar. You look lighter, she said as I sat down. I think I finally am. She reached across the table and squeezed my hand. Lydia's living out near Denver now. Quieter life, smaller house, fewer people to impress. Maybe that's what she needed, I said, stirring my coffee. To finally live without an audience. Aunt Margaret sighed. She lost everything she thought mattered. But maybe that's how some people learn. You can't save them. You just have to let them meet themselves. I smiled faintly. Then I hope she likes who she meets. When we left the cafe, the clouds had lifted. A faint streak of sunlight broke through the gray sky, and for a second, I thought it looked like forgiveness, not the kind that absolves someone else, but the kind that frees you. A few days later, Brandon showed up at my office. I almost didn't recognize him. He looked older, quieter. He stood awkwardly by the door, holding a coffee cup like a peace offering. Mind if I come in? He asked. Sure, I said, gesturing toward the chair across from my desk. He sat, eyes darting around the studio. You did this all yourself? Yeah, I said. Turns out I'm good at building things. He gave a small, nervous laugh. Mom used to say you were stubborn. She wasn't wrong. He nodded, the silence stretching between us until he finally said, I wanted to say I'm sorry. For all of it. For believing her. For letting her tear you down. I looked at him, searching for resentment and finding none. "You don't owe me an apology," I said. "You were just surviving her same as I was." He shook his head. "Still, you were right. Somebody had to stop her." We sat in quiet for a moment before he stood to leave. At the door, he turned back and said, "You did the right thing, Izzy, even if it didn't look like it then." When the door closed behind him, I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. The past didn't vanish that day, but it finally started to fade into something smaller, something I could live with. Later that week, I drove out to a construction site just outside the city. Rows of small houses were going up, the beginnings of the Monroe Project, my foundation for women starting over. The air smelled of fresh lumber and wet earth. A group of workers waved as I approached, and I waved back, feeling the ground solid beneath my boots. I walked through the framework of what would soon be someone's living room. Open space, big windows, sunlight from every angle. I could almost see a woman standing there one day, holding a cup of coffee and realizing she was safe again. That was my revenge. That was my inheritance. That night I stood on my balcony with a cup of tea. The city stretched below, lights flickering like tiny embers. The rain had stopped, but the world still glistened from it. I thought of Bora Bora, the sound of waves, the scent of salt, the moment I turned my phone face down and didn't pick it up again. That was the day everything changed. Back then I thought leaving was the end. But standing there now, I realized leaving was only the beginning. Sometimes karma doesn't come crashing through the door. Sometimes it whispers, showing you that peace itself is the greatest form of justice. Ava called just before midnight. "You sitting down?" she asked. I laughed. "Why, what happened now? One of your designs got featured in Modern Living. They called you the woman who turned pain into blueprints." I smiled, leaning against the railing. "Guess there are worse reputations to have." "You're officially famous," Ava teased. "And you didn't even have to burn down a house to do it." "Just a wedding," I said, laughing. When I hung up, the laughter faded into something softer, gratitude. The wind carried the smell of wet cedar, the same scent that used to remind me of loneliness. Now it smelled like home. I thought about my mother again, not with anger, but with distance. She had built her life out of control and appearances. I had built mine out of truth and light. Maybe that was the truest form of revenge. Before heading inside, I whispered to the night, "I forgive you, Mom. Not because you deserve it, but because I do." The next morning, the first issue of the magazine arrived at my doorstep. The headline read, "Designing Freedom: How Isabel Monroe Rebuilt Her Life and Others from the Ground Up." I stared at the photo for a long time, then set it on the counter. My story wasn't about destruction anymore. It was about foundation. When people asked what happened to me, I'd tell them this: I stopped apologizing for surviving. And to anyone listening right now who's ever been silenced, dismissed, or told they weren't enough, listen carefully. You don't owe anyone your peace. You don't need to beg to belong. You can rewrite your story one truth at a time. If you've ever had to walk away to find yourself, tell me your story in the comments below. I'd love to hear how you rebuilt. And if stories like this remind you that healing can be its own revenge, don't forget to like this video, subscribe, and stay with us for more stories of strength, justice, and redemption. Because sometimes the quietest victories are the ones that change everything.